So in this short video, I'm going to be providing a succinct summary of the key drivers and outlook specific to the copper market. In particular, I'm going to be drawing on the insights of analysts and industry experts as expressed during virtual LME week events that took place last week. As an overview, I'd say copper is probably the darling of LME week. A lot of optimism about the metal. That's very much driven by the strong long-term demand narrative for copper, both in electric vehicles and also from the green infrastructure rebuild that we're likely to see from the pandemic. I think also you've seen kind of tighter supply-demand market balance estimates, both for 2020 and 2021 for copper, than perhaps you've seen across the rest of the base metal complex. The market's benefited very much from strong Chinese imports as demand has rebounded in China. You've seen some element of strong restocking. You've had scrap disruptions, boosted primary cathode demand. And also you're seeing very strong financial interest more generally in copper, because you've seen broader risk appetite across asset classes and also demand for commodities as an inflation hedge. Digging into demand in a little bit more depth, I'd say that Chinese stimulus is really the key driver of the demand recovery, and that's really taken place across infrastructure, construction sectors, very cyclical sectors, but also consumer goods, transport, and that's despite weakness in the rest of the world. It's really kind of helped offset that. I think real consumption globally, though, is still estimated by the IWCC to have declined by around 4.5% in 2020, compared to an apparent demand estimate which is around flat this year, I think, by the ICSG. I think the disparity there is really related to inference that there's been this very significant stock build in China. The other factor that's quite important is I think many fabricators have had to use cathode this year instead of copper scrap, because you've had issues with tight supply, both related to the pandemic and to new scrap import rules that the China has been delayed in kind of implementing, although they're now being implemented from 1st of November. But I think on the optimistic side, the long term, as I mentioned, auto electrification, that move from policymakers, particularly in terms of future fiscal recovery packages that are likely to come in places like EU and the US, that there's going to be very much a focus on green infrastructure that's likely to be very positive for copper demand. In terms of supply, so there's still plenty of smelting capacity growth in China, and that's really kept the pressure on concentrate market and on treatment charges. You've also obviously seen some mine supply disruption, particularly in South America this year, but a large extent that was offset by Chilean supply growth, which held up quite well. Pandemic's still a risk to mine supply going forward. There's concentration risks. A lot of the anticipated copper mine supply growth in the next few years is highly concentrated. About 50% of that from around nine operators. Now, if we look at the market balance and outlook for copper, I think most analysts probably see the copper market as broadly balanced. Some predicting surpluses, some predicting deficits, and I think that's probably at the mercy of different people's macro outlook for next year, really. I think the main caveat for the expected further recovery in demand is really whether Chinese policy tightening in H2 limits some of that demand growth that we've seen in sectors like construction infrastructure. And also, if we could see scrap supply coming in, we could see that easing that demand for primary metal as well. I think financial interest probably likely to be maintained pretty strongly in copper because of those long-term demand prospects, and also because of these ex-China stimulus support and demand for an inflation hedge from investors that you're likely to continue to see. So that was the overview for the copper market. If you'd like to see more LME Week insights, I encourage you to view our other LME Week review videos, which includes a base metals market overview and a drill down into some of the other individual metals. Of course, if you've got any other specific questions or you want a bit more detail on anything I've said, then feel free to get in touch.